Hi listeners, welcome to the latest Footnote episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
Now, as ever, as a glutton for punishment, Alex is taking on not one but two words, just as he has done in the high versus low fantasy episode. We're doing, or I should say he is doing, folklore / folkloric. So before we start, why two? What's the relationship between them?
I just think there's a slight difference between what folklore is and what something being called folkloric might mean. So I just think we'll flag both of them up, but we can come to that.
Okay, all right. Well, it's a term, again, as so many of these terms, it kind of crops up with such regularity as to sort of lose all meaning. And actually, gun to my head, I'm not entirely sure I could define what folklore or folkloric is. So I'm so pleased that I'm just in charge of the timer, which I will start now.
Well, I don't know I'm going to be able to do it either. Folklore...
Great, well that's the end of the episode.
Folklore is a very, very broad, nebulous term.
Okay.
But if I have to try and define it, it basically means all the stuff that people do as part of a culture that is not official, is not a part of official discourse, and is not codified or quantified or qualified, but are things that are necessary for that culture to live, breathe, and exist.
So when you say not official, what do you mean?
Well, so religion wouldn't count as folklore.
Okay.
Literary canons wouldn't count as folklore.
Okay.
Politics would not count as folklore. But not walking under a ladder because you think it's unlucky would definitely count as folklore. Or stories about, if you just think about your family as an example, you could tell the history of your family by looking at like Ancestry.com or looking at birth certificates and death certificates or marriage certificates.
Electoral registers.
All that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Or you could tell it by the anecdotes that have gone down like over the history that just sort of stick in and are part of the glue of what makes you. Oh, remember that time such and such got drunk and kicked the coffee over at Christmas, or that those things that like bind a culture together.
Yep.
But aren't necessarily the things that you would think bind the culture together.
Okay.
That's folklore.
Okay, so it's unofficial in the way that it exists outside of, let's say, quote unquote official documentation.
Yes.
In which case, presumably there's an issue here with rituals and customs, but also you've spoken previously about fantasy's genealogy or roots in oral culture. So what's going on with that in relation to folklore?
Well, so that's part of it, right? Is that it's the stories that are shared and told that bind a culture together, rather than the stories that are given to the culture. So, if you think about, it gets harder and harder to do as we get into a more and more literate and digital age. But if you take like the 16th century and Elizabethan England, Shakespeare is not folklore. Shakespeare is what we study. Shakespeare is Elizabethan literature, quote unquote.
Because it's canonised.
Because it's canonised, it's official, it's legitimised, it's all this sort of stuff. The stories that people are actually telling each other on the streets, in the taverns, in the fields, whatever cliched vision of Elizabethan England you want to conjure up, those are the stories of folklore.
Yeah.
Okay. And those are the stories that aren't necessarily, and they're a completely different culture because they're not owned by anyone. There's no authors of folklore. It's a shared thing. Folk music, folk music is not listen to this, amazing bard sing you a song that they've written. Folk music is the music that's passed between people. It's the songs that people know but don't know why they know them.
Okay, so that's interesting. I didn't know any of this. So it's connected to a sense of sort of cultural consensus, and it's passed on. Does this mean that folklore is, by its very nature, because it is an expression that comes from and is born of culture and isn't canonised, legitimised, authenticated on paper or in an archive? Does this mean that it's open to change and as it's passed along?
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. That's the point of it, is that it's always in flux and it's always codified. And you could
I did not know any of this.
You could be glossy-eyed and like go, okay, and like, romantic about it, which I like to be because I quite like this sort of stuff. Is that actually it's very collective and it's very like democratic, because actually it's about a collective expression of anything. Like, the stories that matter to a culture are the stories that are continually told, and the stories that cease to matter or cease to be functional or that cease to represent a culture cease to get told, and the stories that could be used get changed into other stories. So like Cinderella, like that's a story that people are obsessed with tracing back to the original. There's no fucking original, excuse my French, but there's no original. It's a bunch of cogs and machines and screws that people have warped into different things throughout thousands of years of human history, and it's gone over there and up there and down there, and in this bit it means this and this bit it means that, and that's folklore. It's about what it means to the culture. It's not owned by anyone, it's owned by a culture.
Okay, so it's more so on the one hand it's bottom up rather than top down.
Yes. You can throw a span in the works and go, okay, well great, but like of course like no culture is completely democratic. There's always going to be power structures that dominate who does what, which it's important to qualify that. But like folklore has been a space often where women get more of a voice. It's been a space often where those that are marginal get more of a voice. It does have that kind of baked in history that one can try and celebrate.
Yeah. So what I'm getting is on the one hand that there's a sense of authenticity to actually these rituals and customs and stories of not walking under a ladder or things like this. There's something,
or don't go over there. A witch lives down there, or these things that as a kid you do, right? That's the witch's house. Everyone has a witch's house, like when they're growing up, right? That's folklore.
Yeah. So there's something that's often, or from what you're saying, there's something more authentic and more. Not. It's not that it's more or less credible or more or less official, though official is part of it. But there's something that somehow the folklore or the folkloric traditions tell us a little bit more than the official documents. So does this mean then, thinking about your work on Ralph Bakshi, that there's something kind of countercultural at the same time about folklore, because it's telling an alternate history or an expanded history or a kind of less linear and more potted, fragmented history that is more imaginary? Because that's sort of interesting. It's both a barometer of true culture, because it's about the things that aren't documented and the bits between the cracks, but it's also countercultural because it has that period, or that has that identity. Sorry, of being something different, alternative.
It's countercultural. It's transcultural. It is cultural. Like it's all of those things, because it depends on the relationship between the folklore and the ruling elite, right? But the key thing about it is that it has to be the stuff that exists outside of. There's one thing saying that, this is our culture. There's the top-down stuff that you can do to create a culture, and there's the bottom-up stuff that actually reflects a culture. And it's that stuff that's folklore. And we can talk about folk stories. That's part of folklore. But I'm talking about folk music, folk customs, folk rituals, folk traditions.
Okay.
All that kind of stuff.
So how is this different from the folkloric, or what's the relationship?
It's not different, but it's very simple. Folkloric is an adjective you might give to a story that is codified and all this sort of stuff that has a quality of the folkloric about it. So, we could talk about The Wicker Man as being folk horror or folkloric horror because it's a film that is interested in folk. It's interested in a culture of folk. You could talk about Bob Dylan's music being folkloric. I don't think I'd call it folklore because it's or part of folk tradition. I mean, it's part of folk traditions, but I wouldn't call it folklore. Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited is not, his earlier stuff is not folklore, but it might have a quality of the folkloric about it.
Right. So because I mean, I guess it's not just the adjective of something.
Lord of the Rings is folkloric. It's riffing on things that are in folklore, but it is not folklore. It is stylized as a form of fictional folklore that never existed, written by J.R.R. Tolkien.
Okay. So on the one hand, folklore is, as you were saying, these sorts of customs, tales, sayings, different kinds of art forms that are preserved outside of official streams.
Yes.
And folkloric is a term that can be wielded in slightly more creative ways by writers, filmmakers, to give a sense of that element of folklore to things that are codified and official. So Lord of the Rings is canonized as a piece of canonical literature, or fantasy, but it is also interested in the folkloric as a theme or as a topic or as a part of its
There
narrative.
is currently an Amazon Prime TV series called, is it Amazon Prime or one of these, called The Essex Serpent. Yes. The Essex Serpent is folklore. The story that this thing is riffing
Love
on.
it.
The Essex Serpent, the Apple TV series, one might call has a quality of the folkloric.
Okay. Brilliant. So we've got a minute left. So a couple of sources expanding on this distinction.
I'll focus on folk stories. I'll tell you what, there is a podcast called the Folklore Podcast, hosted by Mark Norman, an academic down in Exeter, who's brilliant. Does an episode every week about folklore, and I would recommend that. If you're interested in the kind of structures and templates of folk stories, their classic work is Vladimir Prop's Morphology of the Folk Tale. We could talk about formalism and all that sort of stuff that he's playing with on another episode, but that's a good recommendation.
Great.
That'll do.
Wonderful. Well, there we go. You've got 15 seconds if you want to say anything extra about folklore. And
go on Facebook and type in fairies, and you'll see lots of groups where people actively discussing fairies they've seen at the bottom of their garden. Folklore is
alive and well.
Oh, and actually, the episode we did with Simon Costin, we also talked a lot about folklore, and he's still, campaigning to set up the sort of museum of British folklore. And his whole thing is that folklore isn't goblins and dragons; it's Notting Hill Carnival. It's there's a multicultural story of folklore that represents Britain now that we could tell as well.
Perfect. There we go. So check out our episode on Pogleswood with Simon as a part 2 maybe to this footnote.
Absolutely. If you have any recommendations for future Footnote episodes, you can email us at fananimresearch, FANAMIM research @gmail.com, and you can use that same tag for our Twitter handle, Facebook profile, and Instagram page. Let us know if you've got any suggestions for future episodes, and we'll be delighted to cover it. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Bye.